Final Fantasy VII featured an incredibly compelling narrative, and one of the reasons it was so compelling is that there were so many antagonists who were desperate for their own slice of the glory. Each ended up opposing the group of protagonists in their own unique way, but what made them special was that no matter if their role was big or small, each of them was still able to make a meaningful contribution, and this was a notion epitomized by Rufus Shinra. Despite only being fought once throughout Final Fantasy VII, Rufus ended up becoming a very memorable figure. This was no doubt helped by how much that encounter stood out, as after not even batting an eyelid to what had happened to his father, Rufus stood toe-to-toe with the game's main protagonist. But it was also down to the design of Rufus and how the actions he took ended up impacting how the story unfolded. It made the role of Rufus, at least in the original game, quite crucial, and as the compilation of Final Fantasy VII built out over the years, the creators placed specific attention towards building upon what had been established, something that has helped to grow intrigue and interest amongst a fanbase who have become more and more eager to consume this new and expansive lore. The Final Fantasy VII Remake has only continued in that regard, but within this specific video, we will have a very narrow focus on the original continuity that was revealed within the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, and we encourage you to stay with us until the end as we analyse the impact Rufus has had as a character. Rufus Shinra was born around 25 years before the start of the new era as the second son of President Shinra. But throughout much of his early life, Rufus was unaware that he even had an older brother, as after being born through an extramarital affair with a slum dweller, Lazard was raised by his mother as opposed to his father. As Rufus's younger brother, Evan, was born in much the same circumstances as Lazard after President Shinra had an affair with his secretary, Annette, it meant he was raised as the sole heir to the company. And as Rufus grew, this became abundantly clear. President Shinra was an ambitious man who was driven by greed and was ruthless in the pursuit of his goals. It's unclear whether he ever intended to father a child, let alone 3, but what is clear is that even though he cared for their well-being, displaying varying degrees of nepotism depending on the circumstances behind their birth, this care was rarely projected outwardly by any show of affection. As Rufus received his education, all he saw from his father was that relentless ambition, greed and ruthlessness. Nothing was ever more important than what President Shinra himself wanted to accomplish, not even his son. But there was also another unfortunate side effect. Rufus was not coddled, but he was nonetheless groomed by his father. As a result, Rufus was granted opportunities that would have only been offered to others after years upon years of work, even being placed on the executive board at a young age. President Shinra was no doubt hoping that by giving Rufus this exposure, he would gain the same ambitions and would want to rule by his side in a manner that none of his hired help would ever understand. But even though Rufus's stock in the company did rise, even acting in an official capacity as his father's second-in-command, all this exposure did was fuel deeper desires, and Rufus started to become a twisted imitation of his father. Instead of wanting to assist and rule alongside his father to help achieve his goals, as Rufus grew and bore witness to more and more of the callous actions Shinra would commit, this meant that all he could do was think about one day overthrowing his father and ruling a population that he viewed as nothing but expendable peasants with an even firmer grip than his father ever dared to. Learning from everything he witnessed and after becoming quite egotistical, the longer Rufus spent on the executive board, the more he started to feel that simply removing his father would not be enough. Doing so without the proper planning would create an unnecessary vacuum, and although his father was blinded by believing that Rufus would run the company someday, there was nothing to say his equally ruthless, ambitious and calculated senior staff would share the same view. Creating alliances would be crucial, and Rufus came to understand that they would be necessary in helping him to weed his father out, taking control of the company from right under his nose and leaving him powerless to resist the inevitable wind of change. Around the same time that Rufus was searching for a suitable partner, a new incarnation of Avalanche was starting to build up a head of steam following the conclusion of the Wutai War. Led by Elfei, they planned to bring down Shinra in order to try and save the planet from its nefarious schemes, and Rufus saw this as an opportunity that could not be passed up. Each party had wider plans that they were not privy to share with the other. Fujito, for example, who was part of Avalanche's leadership team, had much loftier goals than simply working with Elfei to eliminate Shinra, and in the case of Rufus, Well, he cared little for Avalanche's ideologies and their wider goals. He just hoped that they would be able to kill his father at the opportune moment, allowing him to seize control of the company. Avalanche would then receive their just rewards, betrayal, and swift retribution. Until that time arrived, Rufus agreed to act as one of Avalanche's main benefactors, using the vast wealth afforded to him by Shinra to poetically fund the group that was hell-bent on bringing them down, and he also provided them with crucial intelligence relating to their plans, as well as new militaristic developments and strategic targets. In the initial sense, the partnership worked well. Based on information provided by Rufus, Avalanche operatives were able to gain access to crucial data from the soldier program, allowing for the creation of the Ravens. And with this new form of muscle, the threat posed by Avalanche to Shinra started to become very real. With the legitimacy of this new organization established, Rufus next orchestrated an assassination attempt. Working with the leadership team at Avalanche, he fed them critical information about security details, timings, and itineraries about a planned speech in Junin, all so that they could have unchallenged access to his father. And the plan worked perfectly, except the man in charge of pulling the trigger, Fujito, fluffed his lines. President Shinra survived the assassination attempt and in the aftermath became convinced that there was a traitor within the company at a senior level. Using his wiles, Rufus managed to plant evidence that pointed towards Veld, the then leader of the Turks. But after President Shinra took the bait, the Turks themselves sought to prove his innocence, and a thorough investigation pointed towards Rufus. Upon learning the truth, President Shinra dispatched the Turks to deal with Rufus quietly, as even though he was fond of his son, the future of the company was more important than any familial ties. Rufus himself had also become tired of Avalanche and had planned to confront them for their brazen behaviour that no doubt shone a light on his involvement. This confrontation took place just after Avalanche had taken the Coral Macro reactor without his consent, and it was here that a very delicate scenario played out. Rufus had no idea that he had been discovered, but after being surrounded by the Turks and with the threat of custody, he leveraged the situation to not only assert his authority over Avalanche, but use that authority as a means to remove the Turks from the equation. The only issue was that Avalanche no longer needed Rufus. He had been betrayed. It was a humbling experience, but it was just the tip of the iceberg. When Veld relayed that President Shinra now knew the truth, the punishment was even more humbling. Instead of being disposed of or reprimanded the same way that any other senior member of the company would have been for these clear acts of treason, Rufus was instead being confined, or to put it more bluntly, he was being sent to his room to think about what he'd done. Rufus took this as a huge insult. His father knew the truth about everything that had happened, and by his actions showed that he did not even consider his son a threat, something that antagonized Rufus to no end. With nothing but time, Rufus kept himself active from the confines of the Turks' secret headquarters, ready to act when the appropriate opportunity presented itself. And he didn't have long to wait, as after the Turks defected, Rufus concocted an interesting plan that not only allowed him to gain the loyalty of a very talented group of individuals, but owing to fortunate circumstances elsewhere, would allow him to claim control of the company and keep it. Realizing that his father craved the death of Veld due to his perceived lack of loyalty, and that whoever held Veld held the power, Rufus surmised that if he could fake Veld's death and have the remaining members of the Turks be painted as the ones who delivered the desired justice, he could gain some momentum. Momentum that he could then use to prove to his father that he was worthy of his attention, and not just as a son that gained everything through nothing but privilege, but as someone who deserved the position he held. It was a plan that worked to the letter, as after the fake death of Veld became known to Shinra, Rufus was then able to make a case to have the remaining Turks reinstated in their role as the investigation sector of the General Affairs Department of Shinra. But instead of having loyalty to the president, due to his role in allowing them to not just be reinstated, but avoid execution, the remaining Turks now had loyalty to the vice president, Rufus. That loyalty would end up being very valuable not too long after, as after learning about an attack on the Shinra headquarters, Rufus ordered the Turks to take him to the building. En route, Rufus learned that what he'd been dreaming of had come to pass. His father had been slain, supposedly at the hands of Sephiroth, and he was now the president of the company. It should have been a mournful period, but Rufus had no room for sentiment, and upon arriving at the Shinra headquarters, he adopted a very aggressive stance. After all, he was now the president of the most powerful company in the world, and he needed to show in no uncertain terms that he was worthy of the position. That aggressive stance saw him square off in a duel against Cloud Strife, and even though Rufus was forced to retreat due to what was no doubt years of high-quality training, for the most part, he had stood his ground against what appeared to be a first-class soldier. That he wielded such strength empowered Rufus to attempt to assert himself, and one of his first actions was to order the military might of Shinra to pursue Sephiroth, with the Turks being ordered to keep a more discreet eye on the movements of Cloud and his allies. What followed was a frustrating three-way game of cat and mouse, and that frustration boiled over when the three groups collided in the northern crater. Rufus and the other top Shinra executives were forced to retreat, but they came away with a prize, Barrett Wallace and Tifa Lockhart. Both had been part of the annoying group that had been pestering Shinra like flies, and Rufus decided to make an example of them by scheduling a public execution. It was meant to be a true reflection of how Rufus intended to rule, but after the execution was interrupted by Sapphire Weapon, Rufus turned his attentions to bigger fish that needed frying, and by tackling those, much bigger problems, Rufus would be able to show the world the true might of Shinra. In the first instance, Rufus planned to destroy Meteor, and in the second, he planned to destroy Sephiroth. Both would require significant amounts of resources, with the former needing the failed space program to be reinstated, and the latter needing the famed Sister Ray to be moved from Junon to Midgar. But even though both plans were enacted, and the might of Shinra was on full display to the entire world, both plans also faltered, with Meteor surviving the impact and Sephiroth remaining unscathed, even if the Sister Ray had defeated Diamond Weapon and destroyed the defensive barrier that had appeared around the northern crater. To make matters worse, as Shinra fired the Sister Ray, before it was skewered, Diamond Weapon launched a relentless assault on Midgar, and the Shinra Headquarters bore the brunt of it. Before retreating into the safety of a secret passage, Rufus watched on with a steely glaze as he realised everything he had worked for was about to fall apart. After the destruction of the Shinra Headquarters, and having barely escaped alive, Rufus withdrew to Calm, the closest town sympathetic to Shinra. But he wasn't able to enjoy much peace, as after his whereabouts became known, a wealthy former lieutenant from the Shinra army, known as Mutant Carlgate, took Rufus captive. Keen to worm his way out of the situation, Rufus bartered for his life with information, providing passcodes to nearby Shinra warehouses and other useful placements, as well as divulging his plans to build a new city on the outskirts of Midgar, known as Edge. But instead of choosing to assist Rufus in this endeavour, Mutant decided to steal everything for himself, including the plan. Rufus predicted this would happen though, and used his silver tongue to sow seeds of dissent amongst Mutant's team. One such member, Killmister, was a former Shinra scientist who often divulged useful information back to Rufus about what was going on, and that information was then used to encourage Mutant's subordinates to turn on their master, something that allowed Rufus to escape. Seeing Killmister as a valuable resource, Rufus used him to learn about geostigma and its association with Genova. Having been found to have contracted geostigma himself, Rufus received treatment from Killmister at the Cliff Resort, but after Killmister was murdered by the husband of one of his patients, the location was commandeered by Rufus and renamed Healing Lodge to denote his remorse for the actions of his father in damaging the planet. Over the next 2 years, Rufus operated behind the scenes, helping to oversee the construction of Edge in an anonymous capacity, and when required, he attempted to manipulate events relating to Genova in favour of the good guys. When the remnants of Sephiroth arose, this saw Rufus command the Turks to recover the remains of Genova so that they could not be used for nefarious purposes, by other parties of course, and after they had been recovered, he adopted a false appearance to appear weak as he emerged from the shadows. Now back in the spotlight, Rufus attempted to form an alliance with Cloud, only to be rebuffed. And after being questioned by Kadaj numerous times, something that he used to gather information, he determined that the best course of action would be to destroy the Genova cells rather than let them fall into the hands of the remnants. Unfortunately, Kadaj managed to salvage the cells, but Rufus used the distraction as an opportunity to retreat, something that later allowed him to be cured of his geostigma when Aerith called down the healing rain. With the remnants of Sephiroth disposed of, it's unclear what path Rufus took. There were rumours that he returned again to the shadows and used his significant wealth to help fund the World Regenesis organization, but those are unsubstantiated claims, and by the end of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, it's unclear the role in which Rufus continued to play or whether he had truly turned over a new leaf. And that concludes the story of Rufus Shinra, one of the primary antagonists from Final Fantasy VII. Rufus is a rather interesting study, as even though many of his actions on the surface felt unnecessary, to him they were very necessary. It couldn't have been easy being born as the sole heir of the most powerful man on the planet, groomed from a young age and burdened with a huge amount of expectation and responsibility. But due to how his father acted, Rufus always felt he had something extra to prove. It wasn't simply enough to know that one day he would become president of the company when his father planned to step aside. He wanted to earn his place at the head of the company, and the only way he knew how to do that was by mimicking the actions of his father, be cold, callous, and ruthless. After his plot to overthrow his father failed, despite everything being very real and helping Avalanche to pose a real threat to Shinra, to be treated like a child in response must have been infuriating. And as soon as Rufus replaced his father, you could see the clear differences in how the pair chose to deal with situations, perhaps because Rufus felt like he had a point to prove. Everything was big and bold, but despite vowing to rule with an iron fist, Rufus couldn't help but show his softer side, especially after he was forced to retreat following the destruction of the Shinra Headquarters. That Rufus showed remorse and attempted to right the wrongs of Shinra as the compilation built out said a lot about his character, as it's something that his father would have never chosen to do. And on that basis, it's going to be very interesting to see how they choose to depict the growth of Rufus in the Final Fantasy VII Remake and indeed Ever Crisis, as the project will no doubt expand on character motivations and emotional states in the years to come. But yeah, with that small analysis out of the way, that marks the end of this Final Fantasy VII Origins video. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button, share the video around to all the people you know who love Final Fantasy VII, and if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our channel. Also be sure to let us know what Rufus means to you as a character in the comments, and let us know who you'd like us to cover next. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. A big thanks to all our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Raining Eckham, Logan Nijay, Benjamin Snow and Gregory, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thanks to all of you for joining me on this deep dive into the lore of Final Fantasy VII. I hope to see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.